in that we're going to spend a little bit of time afflicting a certain piece of comfort that we all live in. We're leaning into living with yes, this yes and, a particular yes and, that we need to embrace as Jesus followers that can be uncomfortable and hard to navigate. It's one that I know for me, it's urgently necessary for us, for me, in these times that we live in, and for all times when we see injustice and exclusion and the loss of liberties and rights, the slaughter of innocence that happens. And it is a conversation that we must have as we see black and brown bodies treated differently than white bodies, as we see children ripped away from parents at the borders of our country, as we see unequal rights for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, as we see racial profiling and discrimination. And then there are all these things, too, that we do not see, for all the ways in which we don't even notice how the privileges that we have and that others don't have, how our privileges afford us benefits because of the systems that we're a part of that are set up to help out those of certain skin colors, religious beliefs, and resources. So today, that's right, it is a very light subject matter for us to dive into on this gorgeous summer day. Because today's conversation, I will say it's one that we had 2 years ago. We're going to be covering some of the same things that we talked about at that time, but we'll experience it differently as we hold it in the context of, again, this summer series that we're in of what it means to collaborate with God. So for them this morning, it is a conversation for us to talk about what it means to say yes and to our privilege and our power. Because we all have privilege and power that is unique to us. So today we get to ask this question of how does the Jesus story influence the dynamics of our own privilege? And what do we do with that? Even as this is a hard conversation, I think this is one that we long to have. So just again to help us settle in, let's take a moment just to pray and open ourselves into this important task. So God, we do just take a deep breath, continue to settle into this time, opening ourselves up to the hope and possibility that you have for us in our world. And with deep humility, we name that we are people who see such deep injustices all around us. And we are also people who don't have answers to it. Yet we long to see transformation. The transformation of the systems that we're a part of, to see healing and racial reconciliation and peace. So may what we say and experience now move us into your trajectory of making this vision, your vision of our world a reality. So we hold that with great hope in this conversation. Amen. So friends, let's talk about privilege, all right? You ready? You ready? I know. Okay. So I want to start just by engaging our brains, pretty safe territory, by talking about just the definition of what the word privilege means and how we're using it. I think it's always good to take a step back and actually ground ourselves in what an actual definition is for something. So I'm going to offer two definitions. So here they come. The first, two definitions of privilege. The first is this. It's from a scholar and researcher. Her name's Peggy McIntosh, and she talks about privilege as unpacking an invisible knapsack, like a backpack that we carry around that's filled with resources that is just always with us. And she was specifically talking about white privilege in this quote, but there are many other forms of privilege. We're going to get to that in a moment. And this sentiment, it carries over into all of the forms of privilege that we carry. So this is what she says. She says, I've come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I am meant, quote, meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. Pretty powerful statement. I find that image of just this invisible backpack that we get to carry around really helpful. Privilege affords us unseen, unlimited resources that are meant to be oblivious to us. So that's the first definition. The second one just comes from good old reliable Merriam-Webster, and it is this: that privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. So probably kind of how we would define it, that probably aligns what we were thinking already, but it kind of helps us to be on the same page. So those two ways to frame privilege, let's hold on to those and move this conversation from definitions to kind of making it a little bit more personal and tangible, to name our own kind of invisible backpacks that we're carrying. So as we know, we are, you and me, we are every day breathing the cultural air where certain groups of people are considered privileged while another group is not. And in the United States, there are historically recognized privileged and oppressed communities of people. And I have a list of 12 identities that are considered privileged in the United States, with their corresponding then oppressed people group that go alongside. And I'm going to ask us to be a little bit vulnerable with this and take a little bit of a risk. And I'm going to read through the list of privilege, and as I name each of these identities, if it's something that defines you, I'm going to have you just stand where you are, and if it's true for you, and just kind of say, yes, this is me. And I'll invite you to sit as I then name the next area of privilege. And then so what's going to happen is people are kind of sitting as standing as we go through this, just kind of reflecting together on those different areas and whether that is an area of privilege for each of us, those identities. And for those who have difficulty standing, you can just raise your hand to participate as well. Are you willing to try this with me? Can we do this? Cool. So I invite you to pay attention to how often you stand, which means pay attention to how much privilege that you have here in this country that we live in. Some of this may feel vulnerable for some folks that do feel to just not participate at any point in this. And some identities, it may be hard to decide, like, am I this or that? And if that's the case, just go with your gut. With what you sense is right, even if you have to well, it's not quite that, just kind of choose what's right for you. I do hope people who are either watching or listening later would also maybe stand where you are and kind of be part of the exercise too, owning that privilege. And again, just to say these aren't my categories, but these are, again, just what's recognized in our country as areas of privileged identities in our country. All right, so here we go. So I invite you to please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being an adult, age 30 to 55. The oppressed identity is being young or an elder. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being a man. The oppressed identity is being a woman or person targeted by sexism. Please stand if you are someone who holds a privileged identity of being white. The oppressed identity is being a person of color. You may be seated. Please stand if you are someone who is gender conforming or cisgender. The oppressed identity is being gender non-conforming or trans. If these are unfamiliar terms for you, then you should be standing. If this, it just means that you are the typical expected gender. If someone looks at you, yes, this is who you are. You may be seated. If you're a person, please stand if you are a person who holds the privilege of being a person without disability. And the oppressed identity is being differently abled. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privileged identity of being heterosexual. The oppressed identity is being lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, not falling into that box. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who holds the privilege of being Christian. The oppressed identity is being non-Christian. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who has the privilege of owning property, being in the middle class. The oppressed identity is being low-income, working class. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who has been born in the USA. Being born here. The oppressed identity is being born outside of this country. Please be seated. Please stand if you hold the privileged identity of being a socially acceptable body size and weight. The oppressed identity is a body size or weight not considered socially acceptable. Please be seated. Please stand if you are someone who is a native English speaker. The oppressed identity is being a non-native speaker. Please be seated. And finally, please stand if you are a U.S. citizen. The oppressed identity is being a non-U.S. citizen. Please be seated. So my friends, I wonder, what did you notice? about yourself, any surprises about yourself, about privilege that you have or that you don't have, about the kind of invisible knapsacks, the backpacks you get to carry around, what advantages or disadvantages that you have. I wonder too if you notice about the amount of privilege in this room. There's a lot of privilege in this room. And it was pretty powerful for me to work through this the first time. I can stand for every one of them except for being a man. And if you are like me and remained seated for one or more of them, I would guess that you, like me, also have stories of times when you were discredited, forgotten, overlooked, silenced, or maybe even threatened, hurt, put in danger. Times when we've experienced oppression of being in that unprivileged place. What stories we could tell about that. And I'm grateful that these are stories that are being told through the Me Too movement, that Black Lives Matter movement, and just other platforms where oppression is no longer being silenced. But even in this room where there's a lot of privilege, it's powerful and reorienting to actually name the places where we don't have privilege, but also to recognize we hold so much privilege too. So holding just this awareness of our privilege, we place it alongside the gospel, the Jesus story, to look and ask about how Jesus engaged with his own privilege and the power and his place and time in his culture. Obviously, we could spend a week looking at examples of that, but we're going to turn just to a few key places in the New Testament and hear it woven together in a couple different ways. First, we're going to look at a little 6-minute video. It's featuring Christina Cleveland. She's a professor and author. This was filmed just like a conversation in a back room at a conference that she was at, so it kind of moves quickly and fluidly through some beautiful and challenging reflections for us. So I invite you to really kind of sit up and engage and listen to what she has to say. I invite you to try to just grab hold of one thing or the two things that really get you as you're listening to this that you want to remember and walk away with in what she says and how the Jesus story invites us into our yes and to our own privilege and power. I'm going to then help us reflect on that too, but just see what grabs you as we listen to this together.
I think one of the things that's interesting is, the church has really become so much like the empire that we just automatically value the people who look right or look culturally right, speak culturally right, have the opportunities and the capital. But Jesus was the opposite of that. Jesus spent pretty much all of his time standing in solidarity with the oppressed. It's so fun because this summer about 5 friends and I got together every week and studied John's 7 signs. And in every single one of those signs, the people who are given the kind of sneak peek into what Jesus is doing, the deeper understanding of the implications of what Jesus is doing, they're always people who are marginalized in society. Starting in John 2 at the wedding at Cana, it's the servants who get to see Jesus actually perform the miracle. They're the ones who see Jesus' first miracle. And the wedding banquet guy, the guy who was running the wedding, it was all hearsay to him. He was like, wait, what happened? He was the one who didn't know what was really happening. And he had to go get that information from the servants. And so we just see in all 7 of those signs that are supposed to tell us who Jesus really is. John marks those signs as if you want to know who Christ is, pay attention to these 7 miracles. Every single time it's Jesus showing the miracle to women, showing it to crippled, showing it to hungry people. Another one is when Jesus feeds 5,000 and you think there are 5,000 men there, so probably 20,000 people there, massive, massive, massive crowd of people. Who gets to see the miracle? It's the little boy he's the one who actually gets to see Jesus multiply the loaves and the fishes. It's not the rich white guy. He doesn't have that kind of access. The only time Jesus was really saying anything to the rich white guys in his culture, He was typically rebuking them. So,
Jesus wasn't wearing khakis?
no, Jesus wasn't. I mean, the one thing I do love about Jesus, though, is, in the story of Jairus, who had the sick daughter who's about to die, and when Jesus stops to heal the woman who's dying who's got the issue of bleeding. The thing I love about it is, like, Jesus puts Jairus on hold, heals the woman, draws attention to her, kind of uses his platform to show that this woman's important in their society, which I imagine the healing of her identity was probably even more meaningful than the healing of her issue. But then the good thing about Jesus is he still goes and heals Jairus' daughter, because Jesus loves white guys too, you know what I mean? So it's not that he's against people who are in power, but he has very strong words for people who are in power. And in what are you supposed to do with that power? How are you supposed to follow Jesus and abdicating it and leading it to the ground? I mean, Jesus was the most powerful person who walked on the earth, and he used his power in such a way, he redistributed his power in such a way that it led to his death. But it changed the world, and it also led to his resurrection and resurrection for all of us. So there's, when Paul talks about Jesus emptying himself and becoming humble and taking on the life of a slave in Philippians 2, and becoming a man, giving up his privileges as a deity, Paul's talking about how, like, we need to be just like Jesus. Like, that's the example that we need to follow. And, it's easy for someone like me to point to, like, white men, the upper middle class white guy. But, a lot of us, probably anybody who's watching this conversation, has some sort of power that they need to give up. And so for me, it's someone who's highly educated. I'm speaking at this conference here. I mean, I think I'm the only black woman who's speaking at it. But what gives me access?
I think you're the only black woman here.
Yeah, probably. I haven't seen any. I would have given that woman a hug if I had seen one. Yeah. But what gives me access? Well, I actually am privileged when it comes to education. I have a PhD. People want to read my book. People want to hear me speak. Why? I mean, I live in a neighborhood full of people who never went to high school. Their perspectives on race and division in our society are like 10 times more brilliant than mine. But nobody's inviting them to come speak at their conferences. No one even wants to, if they wrote a blog, first of all, you'd have to have access to a computer, and you'd have to have internet and a bunch of other things. So, it's something that we all really have to struggle with. Can you be a privileged person in our society who's not standing in solidarity with the oppressed and actually know Jesus? No, you can't. There's nothing to your faith if you're not standing in solidarity with the oppressed, because Jesus is with the oppressed. And you can't truly see Jesus except through the lens of the oppressed. I'm just a communist.
Whew, right? Girl, it's not so good. I wonder what grabbed you. I invite you to just hang on to that. I'm going to just repeat some of it because it was so good. But today I do, as we talk about privilege, we just have to name again what Christina says. She says, Jesus spent so much of his time standing in solidarity with the oppressed. Yes. With those, he was with those who did not have that invisible backpack to carry around. And I love what Christina says about the 7 signs in John's gospel, that John uses the 7 signs, the 7 miracles that Jesus performs in that gospel, as a special way of revealing who God is and what the life of Jesus looks like. And the only people who witness those miracles firsthand are those who are marginalized in that society. They get to see it, the women, the broken body, the hungry people. Again, like she says, who sees the feeding the 5,000? It's the boy. It's not the rich white guy. The people of power don't have that kind of access to Jesus. I do like her point later, too, though, when she says, it's not like, he also went and healed Jairus' daughter because, I mean, he also likes white guys. So it's that Jesus loves everyone. But that he also has this way of standing with the oppressed. And so for us, my friends, to consider what our yes and is to our own privilege, this is the pattern that is laid before us, this invitation into a life that looks like Jesus' life. Christina mentions Philippians 2, where the Apostle Paul, he pens this letter to the Christians in the city of Philippi, and Paul lays out this invitation. And I want us to hear it as an invitation for us too. So this is our text for today, and just notice I hear it so differently when I listen to it in this context of this conversation of privilege and power. So, Amanda, come on up.
Think of yourselves the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, became human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death. And the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion.
When we hear the headlines that we hear, the news of another innocent black man that has been shot by police, or of a woman who was mistreated or underpaid simply because she's a woman, or that refugees are being turned away, or that our trans friends are being bullied in school or in the workplace, or that our Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters are denied their voice and their own story, how do we feel? Have you, like me, been mad and heartbroken and overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness with what we see in our country and in our world right now? I also wonder, who among us can choose to just tune it out? That's what I find myself doing. That's what we do when it gets to be too much. I remember 2 years ago now choosing to not watch the video of Terrence Crutcher when he was killed by a police officer, because I can't watch violence. It just stays with me all forever. So I just chose not to watch it. But I felt so aware that I had the privilege to make that choice not to watch it. When I have friends of color who do not have that choice, it is privilege that allows us to ignore the suffering that we see, to not see it as our issue, as our own suffering. Jesus saw suffering, right? Like what we see so many weeks of these past years, we see this suffering, systemic and individual oppression. And Jesus, when he saw it, he went right into the middle of it. Jesus saw the suffering of others as his own suffering. And I love that comment in the video about Jesus not wearing khakis. He could have been the khaki-wearing epitome of cultural privilege. But instead, as the Apostle Paul says, Jesus gave up his power and his privilege. He had equal status with God. That's what Paul writes. And what did Jesus do with that status? Jesus' yes and to owning his privilege meant taking it into the middle of the oppressed and the suffering, giving up the conventional use of what privilege and power would look like for the sake of leveraging that privilege for those who didn't have it. My friends, are you feeling heartbroken, fed up with what you see in our neighborhoods and in our world? Then I ask you, as surely as I ask myself, what will we do today with the privilege that we have to stand alongside the oppressed? How will we say yes and to our privilege and leverage it for the sake of those who don't have it? I know this is a big, big question. Christina is right that the life of Jesus, it compels us to wrestle with, to struggle with what it looks like to use, to leverage the privilege that we have, to collaborate with God with our privilege. And the hard thing is that there is no program to follow. There's no perspective or insight that I can't tell you what to do. But at its most basic level, it calls us to be aware of the cultural air that we breathe, and to know what privilege we carry around with us, and to know what others are not carrying. To open up then our own invisible backpacks that we have, and to hand out the resources and the advantages, the voice, the power to those who do not have it. To give it away, because in the giving away, we start to change the story. In giving away, we live the story of Jesus. We collaborate with God, and echoes of what Paul's writing tells us of Jesus emptying himself of his power, emptying his own backpack unto death. So it's a lot to hold, and just as kind of our final thought for this, I want to offer one quote, one challenge, and one invitation. So first, the quote. I want to just restate what Christina said near the end of what we watched, and it's really harsh and direct and yet deeply true, and really the bottom line for us, as she says, Can you be a privileged person in our society who's not standing in solidarity with the oppressed and actually know Jesus? No, you can't. There is nothing to your faith if you're not standing in solidarity with the oppressed, because Jesus is standing with the oppressed, and you can't truly see Jesus except through the lens of the oppressed. Wow. Because that's where Jesus is. We have to do this work of saying yes and with our privilege and figuring out what that looks like. So that's the quote. Next, the invitation. The challenge. Next is the challenge. So to nurture our awareness and to help us just say yes and with our privilege, I do want to offer one thing for us to try this week as we continue to wrestle this out. So that list of 12 identities of privilege and oppression, it's printed on your bulletin insert. So I invite you to take that out. If you didn't get one, grab one on the way out. Bring that home with you. And go through it again and read it and check the boxes that name your privilege and hang it up somewhere in your house as just this daily reminder for the kinds of privilege you have, but also the kinds of folks whose voices need to be heard. And to recognize that privilege that you have and to see how you might leverage it for the sake of the oppressed. And then look for those folks who don't have that same power when you're in your neighborhood, at the store, at the beach, at work, and the news that we see as we vote. In the opportunities that we have to show up, where are the people without privilege? And what can we do to move towards them and be present, giving access to those backpacks that we have that we can share with them? So that's the challenge, just to live with that, be conscious of it, have it visually present with you in the week to come and beyond. So finally then, an invitation. So this is just a small piece of a huge conversation that there are no easy answers to. So we'll continue to have this conversation about privilege and power at Salt House in many ways and shapes and forms. And we will, because we need to keep talking about it, because it is the Jesus story. And one way that we're doing that this summer is through an invitation to hear from a pastor locally named Terry Kylo, who's the director of an organization here in Seattle called Neighbors in Faith, which addresses issues of Islamophobia. From their website, it says, Neighbors in Faith is an effort undertaken by Christians and Muslims to encourage neighborly relationships between Muslims and people of all faith and non-faith traditions, so that together we can work for a more peaceful world. Terry was with us once last summer, if you were here, and he will be here next Sunday, as well as again at the end of August, just to lead us into that conversation, greater understanding for our Muslim brothers and sisters, understanding the industry of Islamophobia, the amount of money that goes into marketing, telling us how awful people of the Muslim faith are. Like, it is a thing, and it is horrible. So just for us to understand all of that landscape, he'll be here next week, but then again at the end of August as well, and he's going to bring some of his Muslim friends to be a part of a conversation that we can have together. And next week as well, after worship, he'll be available for some question and answer time, so he'll be really available to us, which is awesome. And it is awesome, and by awesome, I mean it's going to afflict us in all the ways in which we're comfortable, in a really, really great way, as we examine what it means to say yes and leverage the privilege and power that we have. Particularly in this conversation with Terry, how do we do that with our Muslim brothers and sisters? So I'm excited for us to enter in that conversation together. So friends, a moment now just to check in with yourself in all of this that we've heard and covered. Let's ask the questions that we like to come back to here at Salt House, just the two questions. First, just spending some time in this question of, God, what are you saying to me? So what's bubbling up for you? I invite you to really stay with that first question, to hear what you need to hear from God in this, what came up for you in the video that we watched from Christina, in Paul's letter, in your own experience, who are the people you're thinking of, the experiences that are coming up for you. How is God inviting you to pay attention to that then? So as you're listening for that, then the second question, what am I going to do about it? How is God inviting us to collaborate with God, with our privilege? So I invite us to just hold that in a very sacred way. So we're going to start in a moment. We're going to sing again in response to what we're hearing. And I continue to invite you just to make room to listen, to sing also, but also just make space for whatever you need in the next few minutes. As part of our response, so we're going to sing a song, one that Jason will be leading us in absentia. How do you say the word? Yeah. That. Okay, thanks. So he'll be leading us in that, and it's actually will be punctuated with a few statements of confession. So it's kind of a time of confession for us, kind of naming honestly, ways in which we see others, we see the world, and kind of just standing in vulnerability in that. Feel free to participate as much that you would like to or not. So it'll kind of be punctuating our song that we sing together. And if it's an unfamiliar song, just let the words kind of wash over you. It's just really a beautiful way for us to reflect in this conversation together. So friends, I invite you to stand with me as you are able, as we just open our hearts to this time. So God, we take a moment just to ask for you to keep speaking to us about what it means to say yes and with our privilege. And we do that now in a particular way as we come to you in confession of faith, as we sing, as we listen together.